Hello, friends. I'm DJ Lance Rock, and I have to say, Rock and Roll Grad School is awesome!
This is Rock and Roll Grad School with your hosts Heidi Hedquist and Luke Poling. This ain't no nightclub or CBGBs.
You're looking very wintry. You're in your folklore era. Is that what that is?
Yes, this is
Yes.
it. I don't even wear this kind of stuff, but I have it's still me though. Like if you saw the whole outfit, it would make sense,
Right.
because I've got the Christmassy plaid, which I don't wear a shirt,
Right.
but I have like a leather pencil skirt with a big slit up it and like cool stuff.
Okay, so not your take on Christmas.
Right. I mean, my take on Christmas is I don't even know what it is, but yes.
I would, yeah. I'm ready to hear your take on Christmas.
I don't know what it is. I got nothing.
Right. Involves Christmas from last year, probably.
Yes.
Involves hearts. And hearts being thrown away within 24 hours.
Oh, yes, indeed.
You think?
Possibly.
Possibly. What do you mean possibly?
It involves Bob Geldof.
Okay. Well, I feel
like Christmas every year for me
involves Bob Geldof. Oh.
Well, yes, but actually, I'm realizing every year involves Bono now. From the Bob Geldof era forward.
Right. Well,
so, yes.
if the Boomtown Rats are able to book that Sphere show, then full circle. Full circle.
Everyone's there.
Oh my God,
and
that dude
Niall
don't like
and
Mondays.
John Taylor are there.
There you go.
I mean, that would be a whole other thing.
Exactly. Hello, kiddies. We are going to have a real good time today because we're talking about the Beatles. And is there anything better at this time of year than to dig out your Beatles records?
I mean, it's always
silence.
a good time to do it. No, it's always a good time. No. Again, it's always a good time to dig out your Beatles records.
But I just feel like sometimes I that week in between Christmas and New Year's and leading up to Christmas is the perfect time because it feels like you have stepped out of the time of the year. You've stepped out of the normal schedule and you can just hang out and you can put on music and you don't have to be anywhere. You don't have to do anything. You can just listen to this music and appreciate it for its running time. You don't need to think about I'll finish the first disc of the White Album and then I'll come back and do something else later. You can just enjoy it and let it wash over you.
Yeah.
What say you?
Guess.
You guess.
Well, I feel like our Christmases are just our breaks are very different because these weeks are I never get to slow down and just to hang out.
Oh, this is when very intentionally I'm just not going nowhere.
Yeah, you're luckier than me.
Watch a bunch of movies, try to finish reading a few books, which is something maybe for next week we should sort of put together a little bit of a list of favorite music books of the year.
You can do that.
Because we've talked about a lot of really great books and then I've read a few other ones in the interim while you weren't looking. But we're talking with Kenneth Womack on his new book about Mal Evans.
Yes.
Who I think, yeah, I feel like if you've watched the Peter Jackson Get Back, you've seen Mal in all his glory in the best way possible.
Yes. And you've definitely, most likely, if you didn't know who he was, suddenly been like, who is that guy? That guy's really cool. I like him.
Mm-hmm. And you have definitely heard him.
Yes.
Which is, in reading the book, it's always this shock of oh, that's him. There he is.
Yes.
So it's lovely to talk Beatles at any time of year, but this time of year, I think it's also because always the Beatles plan to have some sort of big new thing released right before the holidays, so
True.
you're usually hoping for that to be under your Christmas tree,
Yes.
and then you just, you know, curl up in a corner of your living room and ignore your friends and family and kind of dive into whatever Beatles related stuff there is.
Indeed.
I mean, I don't know what you
Good
do
or-
with your family, but
I don't know. I dig it.
Yeah.
I'm always digging into the Beatles with or without my family.
exactly.
Again, all these things are things I do all the time. But I
Okay.
understand for many people, yes,
Thank
this
you.
time of year is the time.
And
I'm
then
not
there,
begrudging your sentimentality.
thank you. A couple other things I need to share with you.
Yes.
On top of the meme of the Aretha Franklins. If
Yes.
you can stream this on, I think it's koop.org, and live on the radio if you live in Austin, Texas, 91.7, 11:30 a.m. Christmas morning. David Yao from Jesus Lizard will be reading How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
I mean, that's
I
awesome.
mean, come on. And then the other thing I was going to share with you, this is we were up in Boston and did our family gift swap early. And
Yes.
one of my gifts was the Bob Dylan Mixing Up the Medicine, the doorstop of a book put up by the Bob Dylan archives. And
Yes.
I think this sums it all up. I almost opened the page to this photo, which I don't know if you can see that.
I can see that.
Yeah, that would be Bob and Larry Bud Melman.
Uh-huh. Yes. Not
And
to be confused with Truman Capote, because that's not who it is.
nope, Larry Bud Melman.
I love that.
Which I love that with the book, everyone's like, oh, there's so much stuff in here you've never seen. I open up to that. I'm like, you're right, never seen that.
There it is. Yep,
So
that's correct.
there you go. You got that. You've written a bunch of books about the Beatles. When did this idea, I know part of the book is based on Mal Evans's own diaries and notations, but when for you did you kind of start to think Mal's story is interesting enough to be told on its own this way?
Well, I would never have even begun this project if Gary Evans, Mal's son, doesn't contact me. I mean, that made all the difference. I knew I wanted to support him in his quest to see his father's story told, and that was important to him. So it became important to me. I knew I would do it even if I didn't have access to the material. But of course, like a lot of Beatles folks, I couldn't help asking, is there really all of this stuff?
Right.
And when indeed there was, that made it all the more interesting. But I was going to do it just for Gary. I mean, he's just a wonderful guy, probably a lot like his father, I imagine. I sometimes accidentally call him Mal. And I knew inside of just a few minutes I would do it for him.
Well, I was telling Luke too, when we first started reading the book, even just the foreword from Gary, I fell in love with Gary just in the foreword. Like, it's just, I'm like, oh, I love this guy. And I fell in love with Mal, as many people probably did, just even through Get Back, which was so recent, being like, who is this guy? This guy's great. And then having your book come just made it even better.
Sure. And I'd always wanted to know more. I think like a lot of Beatles people, I was just interested in Mal. I would not have written a book if not for Gary.
Yeah.
And I certainly wouldn't have written this book without all of that material.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's amazing stuff that's in there.
And it's interesting too, because that he's sort of not as well known. I mean, obviously as Brian or George Martin or any of the other sort of people in the Beatles orbit, but how like necessary he was for so many things in their career. I mean, there's obviously the tour side of things where he's lugging amps and all of that stuff. But then just you know, all the stuff he was doing for Paul and George. I mean, for all of them,
For
he was
everyone. Yeah.
really an important part in that Beatles orbit.
Well, it wasn't just like when I even just again, like watching the whole Get Back thing and the role he played just in that piece that we all were privy to finally all these years later. Now, I knew nothing about, I didn't even know his name. And just seeing everything in his whole role through that, like immediately wanted to know who is this person and what is he doing? Why do you think, look, I mean, you kind of can tell through the book, but people haven't read the book. Why do you think he sort of did fly under the radar to the whole popular culture that's so obsessed with everyone around the Beatles until now?
Well, I think, you know, until people saw him in Get Back, I don't think folks really knew how central he was to this story.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I think I started thinking about the folks in the Beatles orbit in a different way a few years ago. We had a new honors dean here at my university, and she had a really cool way of introducing a guest speaker, a big luminary come in, right?
Mhm.
And she said, before I introduce, you know, famous person, I'm going to talk about all the invisible people who really make all this happen.
Yeah, I love it.
You know, Mal and Neil Aspinall and all those guys were the invisible people who really made it all happen. And,
Right.
you know, nobody does it alone. We all have our Mals who are helping us to bring projects to fruition. And I think he's interesting just for that reason, you know, in the same way that um, I would love to know, and obviously this is mostly, if not entirely, lost to history. I'd love to know who helped Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
No, he wasn't just you know, some one-man show. We know that's not true.
And it's interesting too. I mean, the book is rife with this back and forth between Mal and his wife, and the fact that when anything came down, when any Beatle called, it was, I gotta go help them out. Do you think it was that he kind of saw what they were doing and realized, like, this is important stuff? Like, this is the first time these things are happening. Obviously, you can't imagine that they're going to be making Sergeant Pepper or whatever in the future, but just did he recognize kind of like this was either his way out of Liverpool or that these guys were really something and they needed all the help they could get?
Or was he the ultimate
Yeah,
people pleaser?
I don't know that I don't know that he needed a way out of Liverpool or anything like that. I think that he was like a lot of people who would come into their orbit, like Stu Sutcliffe, right? Who said, I just want to see what's going to happen with these guys. You know, Stu was a very talented artist. He had no business really wasting his time with them, particularly knowing what we know now about how little time he had.
Right.
You know, Mal just at first wanted to see what was going to happen. You know, these guys seem really extraordinary. This seems unusual. And there are a lot of folks who would encounter them and say, you know, I'm just going to stick around and see what this is going to be. And I think Mal was that guy for a while. I mean, the tragedy of the story really is Lily, you know, who is she's such a champion of and for Mal. It frustrates me to no end to think about how often she got the short end of the stick.
No.
You know, at first Mal just wanted to see what was going to happen, to see if there was any upside. But I like to take us back to that moment when we realized that, you know, nothing is a foregone conclusion. These guys, you know, for all intents and purposes, should have just been in and out in 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I think if they don't have George Martin sort of piloting the way and giving them the space and the encouragement to be something greater, they probably are in and out in 18 months.
Yeah.
You know, there's that real turn you can see with I Want to Hold Your Hand and the album A Hard Day's Night, where, you know, there's an explosive move upward. You know, if not for that, you know, Mal's back in Liverpool trying to figure out how he can get his old job back.
Yeah.
Which wasn't going to happen, as you guys know.
Right. Nope. That ship sailed for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and to the extent you were saying about the long-suffering wife, whom definitely his wife is the like textbook definition of long-suffering. How much of this did the family know? Did Gary know? Or did you come to him with stuff where he was like, really? My dad was there. My dad did that. Like, did they know about his collaboration with Paul on song lyrics?
They knew
Which
about a few of them because they're right there in his notebook. So, for example, in the blue 1966 notebook, he's very excited because he's helped out on Here, There, and Everywhere, and he got to sit in, by himself with Paul when Paul sang the vocal, and that was exciting for him. But outside of that, there were lots of times when I would, after doing my research, and I also spoke to several hundred people as well. After this process, there were a lot of stories I was bringing to them that they had no idea about, which makes sense because, when you look at the Beatles timeline in the 1960s, really even after to a certain extent, they are just inordinately busy.
Yeah.
Like people are who are driven, right? They're constantly busy. They have something they're working on that they're thinking about. And, Mal was part of that engine and he was helping to keep, those wheels on the track. So I'm not surprised they didn't know about everything. They simply couldn't.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there anything that came through in speaking to those hundreds of people that just surprised you?
Part of the challenge with talking to people about Mal is how beloved he was. So
Yeah.
most people, and of course, because he dies in a tragic way, people want to say that he's affable and speak about the tragedy of his death. And that sort of doesn't leave any space for nuance. So
Right.
what I would do is I began to do a lot of additional study so that when I would come to somebody, I would cite a moment in the diaries or a moment in the story to try to help, but take them out of the space where it's just all sunshine and sadness, right?
Mhm.
Mal's so affable, isn't it tragic how he died?
Right.
And I found that that was a good way to try to get stories about him that were more real,
Yeah.
which is tough to do.
It's very
So
tough to do.
it is because people, most people don't want to say anything badly about the dead, particularly, with a story that has these kinds of contours to it. So
Right.
that was probably the biggest challenge. But what I discovered, and I enjoyed discovering, was just how many people I would speak to who were inventing their job. Rock and roll at this point, when Mal gets involved, it's what, 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
The Beatles. So it's really a new enterprise. And even Mal's LA girlfriend, Fran, I mean, she was inventing her job. She was the booking agent at the record plant. She had to figure out how to make that into a career, right? It was a powerful position. If you were in LA, you wanted to record at the record plant or Capitol Studios, so it was much sought after terrain. She had to invent that job. I would speak to other roadies who invented their jobs, or people who invented the jobs of being record players, right? All of, I found that to be really endlessly fascinating about just how quickly this world created itself.
Yeah.
Mhm. And to your point about the sort of sliding doorsness of all of this, where if the Beatles don't meet George Martin, maybe they don't, if they don't get that push, maybe they don't end up where they were. It seems like there must have been a lot of times in your research for this book and all your other Beatles books where it just comes down to, I mean, the day John and Paul met, like just this fraction of a second where everything could have gone spinning off in a completely different trajectory, and we're having a different conversation now.
Yeah, I think that there's so many moments like that, right? Along the pathway to this story. I mean, it shouldn't have happened, the Beatles story. It was, as far as the proper channels in the early 1960s for somebody becoming a big pop act, they weren't going through them. What I love about teaching the Beatles in my classes here at Monmouth University is that they they're outsiders. George Martin's an outsider in the sense that he's not really posh, he's faking. Brian Epstein, failed at everything he's ever done until he ran his family's record department. The Beatles are from Liverpool, which is a big giant, X
Right.
again. So, these six guys get together and you throw in Mal and Neil as their ballast, and they push over an entire international industry,
Yeah.
which is kind of remarkable. And it, of course, it doesn't happen if you don't have these remarkable songs that start coming one after the other across a 7-year period. It's funny in after a lot of my talks, if I'm speaking about George Martin, I'll occasionally have somebody say, well, they still would have been big if they hadn't met George Martin. And that's just crap.
Yeah.
It's utter garbage, because if they'd gone with the Decca producer who kind of was originally into them, he would have turned them into Cliff Richard and they would have been in it. As a young guy, he would have been looking for hits. George Martin had a gigantic axe to grind with the world, and he was driven in his own way, and they, damn it, were going to be the vehicle for that. So, you need every one of these pieces for it to end up the way that it does. Arguably, as disgusting as it could be, even Alan Klein, right? Part of the Beatles' mystique is that, after their last photo session, they walk off the stage forever. They don't come back, their recent '1 song and other moments notwithstanding, right? They do not come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating because it does, we all feel like there'll never be another Beatles. Well, I feel that way. But then in the conversation, you start to think, what if there is that magical group of talent out there that just haven't met the players? The stars didn't align. Their George Martin didn't turn up. And it's crazy. I don't want there to be another Beatles, but I do want there to be another Beatles. It's very, I don't know.
I want one very badly. I definitely do. I have no doubt about it. I would love to see another Beatles like Pop Explosion. Arguably Michael Jackson perhaps was the last.
Yeah.
But even then the whole terrain had changed, by
Right.
that point in the world of media. So it's hard to say whether that is the same thing. But but the larger point is, I would love to see that kind of musical fusion again. And I worry sometimes that because we have such a noisy media world that I'm missing it and it's out there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's kind of the same thing where it's like, is it somewhere? We just don't know it yet.
Yeah. And that worries me.
That's fair. I agree with that. I totally agree with that.
And knowing the story and knowing what they went through, I also wonder, just obviously the times have changed, but anybody able to have that impact and that reach that they did, you could argue Taylor Swift has that now, but she's got a few years behind her already to get to this point. And they sort of just all of a sudden were on that stage, overnight pretty much, where it's just a different landscape for anybody to reach those heights and that that big an audience.
That is a really good point about Taylor, and maybe we're not understanding, because we're still in it, the nature of her, what is an incredible market share right now. It is upending the way we think about the charts, for example, right? When she releases an album, every song charts.
Right.
Consumed at that level by her audience. So I know there's a new book in the works by my friend Rob Sheffield of Rolling Stone, and I'm really excited about that because I think it will help us to start to understand just what it is that is happening, with the Swifties and with the way that kind of saturation's occurring. And of course, a career is different and longer now. As you said, she's been around a while. But, maybe she hasn't been around long enough to record her Sgt. Pepper or her White Album or her Abbey Road. She's not at the end yet, right? So, and if you start to plot her music, particularly the way she takes ownership of it, you can see these really key moments of growth.
Agreed.
I mean, I just love the stat. I read that if you place her career trajectory alongside the day of release of her first record to Madonna's, she would be right now at the music era of Madonna's career,
Yeah.
which is mind-blowing because how many times at that point was Madonna considered the comeback kid? Like she had gone away and just this back and forth. Between it's interesting too that this book about Mal, it's 500 pages, and I mean that in the best possible way.
Yeah.
Like the best for me, the best Beatle books. This one is great. Obviously the I'm blanking on his name now. All of a sudden, I've got the Mark Lewison, that first volume of his.
Tune in. Yeah.
Yeah, where I never thought I'd be that interested about George Harrison's grandparents, but I am. And this one similarly, it's like
Mhm.
I don't know how many other bands have roadies that could be dedicated to this much space and time, and it is all important. In all of your research about the Beatles, does stuff surprise you still, or do you kind of feel like I've got a general sense of what happened in that? Again, that's such a small window of time for them.
There are details all of the time that surprise me, and sometimes I'm surprised when I'll hear a song about how it's reaching me on different levels than it did maybe
Mhm.
30 years ago or what have you. So, um, I generally liken the Beatles to one of the greatest industries in the history of my other part of my life, which is literary studies, and that's Shakespeare.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I mean, the Beatles are Shakespeare. They're
fair.
endlessly interesting. Shakespeare has 37, 38 plays, depending on how you want to count it. Lots of poetry, thousands of characters. The Beatles have all these stories too, and they have all these
Yeah.
characters, and they have all sorts of historical characters that we know about that are important to their story. It's just a big world. It looks like it shouldn't be, right? But it actually is a very large world, especially if you throw in their solo careers, where they'll have 20 number one songs as solo artists, which is pretty amazing because those are probably not the best 20 songs of them as solo artists.
Right.
Hmm.
Of course.
That's really remarkable and very wide story. It's a wide lens. And I do a thing here called Record Club at Monmouth University, and I've been doing it. I think we're in our 8th year, believe it or not. We do it once a month, and we pick a classic album. It is remarkable just how much of music you can trace to the Big Bang of the Beatles, right? So they create this Big Bang of songwriting and musicianship that's being felt, today, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like the way that, Einstein proved, and it took us 100 years to demonstrate it, that you can still hear the echo of the Big Bang because it was that loud, right? It
Yeah.
was the Big Bang. So, it's remarkable just how deep and profuse that influence was. I sure hope that at some level, when they're sitting around having vegetarian meals, probably near Ringo's place in LA, that Paul and
Yes.
Ringo acknowledge this, even if just for them, when nobody's listening, how ridiculous and wonderful it is that they got this little beat band together, in 1962 when Ringo joined, and this happened,
Right.
because it's so phenomenal. It's and so large. I just hope that they take the moment to have that conversation, or at least that acknowledgement, because in their case, there's nothing wrong with gloating a little bit.
Oh God,
Oh,
no.
it's okay to be Paul McCartney. I mean,
Yes. And it's okay to be
it's his worst
happy.
work. Yeah.
It is okay to be happy that you're Paul McCartney. And it is okay to be happy that you are Ringo. And Ringo is very happy that he's Ringo. And it makes me happy that he's Ringo.
And one of the things I love about this book and this project is that there is this B-side to it that's coming in a few months. Is that I don't know if you call it a second volume, but it is a lot of the ephemera and things that you talk about in the book in
Yes,
great detail,
awesome.
which it's great to read it and then kind of go like, I can't believe I'm going to get to see this
I
thing.
know the
Like,
anticipation.
At the moment, we're calling it just as a working title, Malcolmy.
That's
I
amazing.
actually love that. Don't change that.
Harry Evans came up with it, and I kind of like it. I don't know if the
like it
press will
too.
ever go for it, but um, it is exciting because it means folks will get all of this material for themselves, right?
Right.
Yeah.
They'll be able to go out and go down their own rabbit holes and get lost in the Beatles story in new kinds of ways. There are thousands of names in these documents, all sorts of references to songs, people that the Beatles bump into. I think it'll be an interesting kind of DIY project for other people.
Oh,
New photos, and when you look at new photos, of course, they do tell massive stories. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. The one in the current book, which we'll reproduce, I'm sure, in Malcolmy. The photo of Mal and Ringo on horseback is just, to me,
Yes.
I just love that exists.
Yes.
It's so bizarre.
I love it so
So
much.
strange that here they are riding in Spain on horseback,
Yes.
and they're lost in the moment of riding. They even have these looks on their faces. It's just, photos like that to me are the damnedest things, because they're not
They're
the
my favorite.
photos that we're used to.
Right. Those are the ones I always want around my house. Always. I'm always like, I need that in my house, big, on the wall of the dining room. It's just
That's right, because it's such a conversation piece.
yes.
It just doesn't make sense to me when I look at it.
But that's what's so great is it makes no sense and yet all the sense in the world
That's right.
simultaneously.
It can be both. That's right.
Yes, it's so true. I love it. It's going to be amazing. And it just, even from looking at like the legacy for Mal too, I think it just, that desire he had so much to be famous and to be seen and just to have that legacy now, even though he's, not here to see it in person, it's going to be pretty amazing too.
Yeah.
It's sweet.
What do your students make of the Beatles? Obviously, it's a little bit of a self-selection where people who are taking courses on the Beatles have some interest. But do you see kind of a continued interest or a continued fascination that everyone a little bit older had with them?
It's a self-regenerating kind of issue. I mean, I look out in class every now and then, and we'll be listening to, I don't know, From Me to You, right? And half the class is singing along. They already know the lyrics. They usually have made the discovery already, and if they haven't, they leave having made the discovery. I mean, it's not any different than any of us making the discovery. They're doing it the same way. It just maybe it's on Spotify or in a commercial or what. I mean, think about this new In My Life commercial is it Amazon, who has an In My Life, and God knows what they paid for that. But
Right.
imagine how many Beatles discoveries that has caused. I don't even think we can count them. I mean, it's tens of thousands, if not 100,000, of people old and young hearing that and thinking, wow, that seems like a damn good song. And then going and playing the original,
Right.
which is just arresting,
Yeah.
and oh yeah, I did hear that at a wedding once. And then the next thing you know, they have all this great music, which was always John Lennon's prophecy. One of the last things he said is, you don't need reunions. You already have the records.
Right.
He was right then and he's right now. I mean, that's what matters, is that music. So they make those discoveries. Now they've had an interesting semester here. We just did Abbey Road this week, so we've kind of completed the year. But when we did our mini book tour, Gary and Julie Evans stayed here at our house, and they went to 2 classes. They went to
Oh, wow.
Sergeant Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. And
Mal was so involved in the mystery tour, to say nothing of Pepper.
Were blown away because now they're in class and they're looking over, and there's this guy who looks just like Mal
Right.
sitting there. And actually, the day before the last class, we had gone for the Magical Mystery Tour. We had gone to the city, and we went to Strawberry Fields, and
Yes.
and Gary had never been there.
Oh,
And,
wow.
I mean,
I had to.
he was, this is a guy he knew that hung out with him as a kid. I mean,
Right.
he was very moved. And at the end of class, because we were about to transition to the White Album, I play, Lady Madonna, Hey Bulldog, and Across the Universe, because those are the songs
Yeah.
they record before Rishikesh, and when Gary heard that acoustic version of John Lennon, just his voice, he got very emotional. He actually walked out of class.
Oh, I
And
mean,
and when we got back the next week, Gary and Julie had gone back to London at this point. I said, I think everybody noticed what happened there, right? We're in a laboratory sense talking about the Beatles all semester. That was real. That was a very real emotional moment by a guy, thinking about a real person who at a certain level probably helped raise him a little bit,
yeah, of course.
When I was doing my John Lennon book a few years ago, I played some of my presentation for Gary, and he heard this part where John is talking to Sean, and he choked up. And he goes, "That's how John used to talk to me when I was 5."
Wow.
And it just reminds us just how human this story is and how real it is. I tell my students that every semester. This is not, we're going to want to call them geniuses. I don't use that word. These are real people. One guy's going to be murdered. Another guy's going to die young. Another guy's going to disappear because of an overdose. All of these things that happen are real. And, they're friendships that are going to be broken, that they're going to spend the rest of their lives, which in one guy's case is 10 years, trying to repair.
Right. Well, and that was one of the things too in your book, in this book, at the beginning, like as they're all sort of getting on this journey and realizing how real they were, remembering how young they were, and some of the things that you're kind of like, oh dear Lord, you didn't really say that, did you? But it adds to, these are a bunch of young guys hanging out, being young guys, doing their thing. That just happened because of all the things we've talked about to literally change the landscape of the world.
I like that you noted that they're young guys. So one of the questions I've been getting all for years now since this project was announced is, well, didn't the Beatles rip off Mal by not paying him? When Brian dies, they're in their 20s.
Right.
They don't know what the hell they're doing.
No.
I mean, the mistake I think was Mal's for exiting the story too soon and not sticking around a little longer to start getting paid like everybody else when Apple has its second and third acts, right? I mean, that's in a way that's on Mal. I know that's not precisely the way to put it because it sounds like I'm victim blaming Mal. But he's the one who wanted out. If he had stuck around, imagine the joy he would have been experiencing, when Now and Then was #1 or all of these other wonderful projects. They were young guys who didn't know what the hell they were doing. They were worse than that. They were nouveau riche young guys.
That's true.
All they were doing, who were involved in dozens of lawsuits. So
yeah, it seems he would have really reveled in all of this. The
Oh
sort of
my God.
celebration of their work and the way people just, the conventions and all of that, hey, you were there. You're that guy. You're the guy with the anvil. I mean,
and let's face it, we know that Neil was there in December 1975 to take Mal's pulse on what he wanted to do. I mean, he wasn't there for fun. Paul was talking to Mal about, the next phases of what was happening. They'd finally dissolved the partnership so they could go build a new one that worked for them.
Right.
It's a damn shame that Mal was in his moment of crisis at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Well,
at some point you do have to be your own advocate. I've learned that from my own years of therapy.
And of course, once again, though, there's no way that Mal could have known any of this.
No,
right?
of course,
Right,
course, totally.
And he made the choices he made one by one.
Yep, exactly.
how do you write this book without kind of not giving away the ending, but it must have been hard in some ways, seeing all of this success and delight, and then knowing that this story in particular has a very, very sad ending to it.
Well, it meant making sure that I hit the notes where you could see Mal changing.
Yeah.
The way he picked a fight with his mother, for example, around 72. When Gary told me that story, I kind of made a middle note, and then you could find other moments like that. A lot of them come after when the moment when he's forbidden to work with Badfinger by Alan Klein. I see that as kind of a cliff
Yeah.
for him that really frustrates him because he wanted that so badly. He wanted that far more than he wanted, somebody to give him co-authorship credit or anything. He wanted Badfinger to be a success, and his impulses and belief in them, of course, were right. But you start to see these moments where he's making the mistakes that he's not going to be able to undo.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting irony that, the person who busts him is John's ex-wife. When, she basically says, we had dinner with your cousin, in LA, and we don't have a cousin in LA. And,
Yeah.
suddenly Mal's worlds collide. Really, at that point, there's almost a countdown. He can't, because at that point, it's amazing, right, that Lily gave him 2 years.
Yeah.
At that point, she should have been like, you're a good guy. I love our kids. We're getting divorced. The
Yeah.
fact he waited so long, even to make an appointment to see a solicitor, is fascinating.
Yeah.
I wish I'd been able to get more from her about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you got a lot. Let's.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Stress
no,
it.
I got all.
Just started just getting greedy.
And I guess she'd been understandable. She'd been understanding for a long time by that point. She'd
Yeah.
obviously,
Oh yeah.
she decided that her threshold was very, very high.
Yeah.
And
Well, when
she's-
you've been on all those roller coasters, right? You've been on all of them. It is hard to get off because you're like, I've ridden this ride for so long. What's one more hill?
right. And, if your kids are just can't wait till daddy comes home. And of course,
Right.
1974 is before, the great increase in divorces.
Oh, yeah.
That was a different marital world too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. My parents got divorced when I was 5. It was like 79, 80.
That
And
was
it
a
was the
big
shock
deal.
of the century. And I now know it was a big
That's
deal.
right.
But
And
back
they were
then in my
probably
school,
the talk of the town.
oh, yes,
I remember divorces around that time. It was a big deal. Like,
it was a very
hear
big deal.
about the Sherwoods. What?
Right, right, totally.
Yeah, I mean, it was a big deal. So certainly that was true. There's also another good reason that I don't think I articulated in the book, but that's okay. Lily didn't have any family. Her family was Mal's family.
That's a
Her mother and father had been long dead, so really, her people were Mal's people, and that's got to be a tough world to exist in and to try to maneuver.
yeah, that's fair too.
Living the Beatles Legend, the untold story of Mal Evans, is available right now from Day Street Books, wherever you get your books. For more information about Ken Womack, his Beatle books, and everything else he's written, check out his website, kennethwomack.com.
You can check us out on all the various socials. Be sure to visit our website at rockandrollgradschool.com, and don't forget to leave us a review.
Today's show is produced by myself and Heidi Hegquist. Our reluctant producers are John Sauvé and Sandy Stone. Our willing producers are Rachel Allen and Randy Jeanette. Our intern is Zach Jackson. This one's for Philippe. Thank you, good night, and may all your favorite bands stay together.